All right, in this lesson, we're going to talk about how can I determine the square and square root of a number. So to start out, you really need to think about, like, what is a square? Well, when I think of a square, I think of this, like, oh, it has the same amount on each side. So I might have 1 unit by 1 unit. And then you think about things like area, which is measured in square units. So for example, the area of this square would be 1 times 1, because it's length times width, and that would equal 1. Say, for example, I had a square that was 2 units here and 2 units here. So if I draw a line, so I have 1, 2, draw a line, so I have 1, 2. Now I say, okay, what is my area? Well, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 square units, because the area is 2 times 2 equals 4. So when you're thinking of like the square of a number, you're really thinking of if I had a square and the side length was that, what would the area be? That is what the square of a number. You simply multiply the number by itself like you're figuring out the area of a square. To kind of represent that, you might have a square, like so, and say the square had a side of n. Well, that means all the sides are n, so if I do n times n, that's going to give me the area. And basically, you could represent this as n with the exponent of 2, n squared, the number times itself, which would then give you the area, gives you the square of a given number. And say, for example, we come up back to this problem again, and let's just say that n is going to equal 3. In that case, you split each side into thirds. Now, normally these would be equal, but you can kind of see the point. There are 3 times 3, or 9, meaning that 3 squared is going to equal 9. And you represent that little exponent, that little number to the top right corner of a number is the exponent that basically says multiply this number by itself that many times. In this case, we're talking about squares, and so we're talking about 3 squared. The other place you may have seen this before is going back to like area, like, oh, we're talking about, a square unit, right? So you have the area of this square is 1 by 1, so it's 1, maybe it's talking about centimeters, right? So we had centimeters here, and then this would be centimeters squared. Ta-da! That's why it's centimeters squared, because you're talking about a square, and you multiply 1 times 1 to get your area of 1 square centimeter. Now, if we're going the opposite direction, what you really need to do is take a look at a multiplication table, or just maybe, make a chart where you're sitting there and you're saying, like, okay, I have 1, 2, 3, and now I'm multiplying by 1, 2, 3, and if you look down the middle, you kind of 1, 4, 9, and these are going to be like your perfect squares down the middle of this chart here. And they would continue down to 4, where you'd have 16, which would be 4 times 4. To figure out now, when you come and do like a square root, you're going to see a symbol that looks very similar to division, but is subtly different. It's called a radical, and it looks like this. This is called a radical. And then underneath it, you'll see a number like, say, 25. And that number is called your radicand. So you have your radical and your radicand. Now, you would read this as the square root of 25, or as radical 25. What you're trying to do is figure out what number times itself equals 25. And really, you would work backwards in a chart like the one you have up here, and you would know that right down here would be the next number, which would be 25, which is 5 times 5. So that means that the square root, or radical 25, equals 5. The catch here is that technically, the square root of 25, well, what if I had negative 5 times negative 5? That would equal 25, because 2 negatives equal a positive. So technically, you really have 2 choices for your square root, positive or negative. Generally speaking, we're going to be focusing in on the positive, but I want you to be aware that it is potential. You could be positive or negative. So depending on what the question being asked is, you may want to consider that there's a negative square root to every positive number when you take the square root of it. Also note that it's impossible to take the square root of a negative number, because the no situation, could I do negative 5 times 5 and equal a number? So this is going to equal 25, right? So this means I'm not multiplying a number times itself. So I'm not doing a square to get to negative 25. So you shouldn't be taking the square roots of negative numbers. That is bad, 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 bad. Don't do that. You will worry about that eventually in math. I don't think we cover that this year, though. So again, this is how you would take the square root or find the square of a number. You just kind of got to use a multiplication chart for your square root, or know and memorize them. I memorize them up to 400. 400 is 20 times 20. And so the square is just when you multiply a number times itself using the little exponent, the 2. So like n to the second, n squared. That is squared. And then your square root would be, you take like the square root of n squared. Oh, that's easy because that's n, because you're just saying, yeah. All right, there we go. So that is how you can use squares or square roots.